Hi, this slideshow movie thing is doing double duty. It's probably going to help you out when you're doing your newspaper analysis, but really it's also useful for week 3. So I'm posting it sort of halfway through week 2 and reposting it for week 3. So that's just to let you know. This is a lecture that does a lot of work. So in the newspaper articles that you're working with in week 2, there are lots of quotations. And I want to put another definition out there to say that quotations, or most of the quotations that we're looking at, especially in journalistic writing, are a clause within a clause. So what do I mean? By this? Let's take a look at this example. Mr. Bass said collapsing buildings were just one of many threats. So this isn't a quotation, but we're looking at one of these special kinds of verbs that I call verbs of saying and showing. This verb said. So said, when you say said or when you say showed or something like that, you have to include as the object of this verb, and we've talked a little bit about objects, what these verbs want as their object is an independent clause. So what happens is that you see there are two verb phrases, said and were in this case, and there are two subjects. So let's have a look at the second bullet point. Mr. Bass is the first subject, said is the first verb phrase. Collapsing buildings is the second subject, and were is the second verb phrase. So I'm doing this now for week 2 because sometimes it gets confusing. I've told you to look for the verb phrase, but what happens when there are two? Well, usually when there are two verb phrases, it's this kind of thing. So on the next slide, I'm going to show how to analyze them. So what we really have is one clause inside another clause. I should have done the leftmost square bracket in red as well to show this nesting. So Mr. Bass said collapsing buildings were just one of many threats. This is an independent clause in its own right, and we can think of that one as Mr. Bass being the subject, said being the verb, and this whole other independent clause being the object. Then we have the independent clause that's in the inside, the internal clause, and it has its own structure. So does that make sense? To say that the whole thing counts as an independent clause, and then we've got an independent clause inside as well. So the independent clause inside is complete in its own right. The external independent clause is not complete without this internal one, because the internal clause is the object of that first verb said. I hope that makes sense. Basically, two verbs, one that says, when you're like a native speaker, it says this kind of verb takes as its object an independent clause. So all these saying verbs take clauses, or in fact they can take things bigger than clauses. They can take whole sentences as their objects. So here's another example. Asked. This asked has two objects. It's a verb that says, when you're a native speaker, it says, oh, I need to ask someone something. So the someone in this case is the 11-year-olds, and the something is what they would do if an earthquake struck right at that moment. That's a bit of a funny structure, but we still see that we have the subject, they, and the verb phrase, would do. And then you've got if an earthquake struck right at that moment is another dependent clause. What's important for us here is that all fits together to fulfill the requirement of saying what the subject of the big clause asked. So it's all about the verb. The verb tells us what kind of stuff it has to be followed by. Let's look at the second example about Peter Yanev, who's the subject of the big clause. Noted is the verb phrase of the big clause. So we have noted that. If you've seen week 3, lecture 3 already, we know what that is doing. And then we see a big sentence which has a prepositional phrase in Turkey and other developing countries, has a dependent clause, even when someone with an engineering degree was involved. dependent clause. And then we have that was no guarantee of safe construction. That's the independent clause. Because there was little specialized training or licensing. Another dependent clause. So a very complex sentence, all as the object of this first verb noted. Got it? You can pause this, write it out, and see what I'm talking about. The other tricky thing about these saying verbs is their object can come before or after the verb. This is a bit tricky. So this is a quotation, and the author, because they want to highlight the quotation itself rather than who said it, they put the quotation first. So we see the quotation has a subject, the improvements are great. The improvements, subject to the first clause, the building, subject of the second clause, and then there's two verb phrases too, are and may collapse. That still is an adverb. So we've got again a sentence as the object of the verb of saying or showing, and then we see this, I can call it a matrix verb. Lots of different ways of talking about it. Matrix verb, big verb, first verb, top verb, external verb. All of them mean the same thing. So this is the analysis that I've given. So we see two independent clauses nested within one big independent clause or a sentence, and then there's another one on the outside. So if you can match up all the brackets, the curly brackets and the square brackets, you'll see the structure. So we're going to call the element at the heart of this sentence within a sentence constructions, or sentence within a clause constructions, I guess is better. We call them a verb with a clausal complement. And a complement just means the verb requires it. It's not optional. And the non-optional entity that it requires is a clause. So they're really special kind of objects, but we see them a lot in journalistic writing and in academic writing, because we do a lot of quoting in academic writing too. There's other verbs that take funny stuff as their objects. There's things that we saw in the first week. Probably mostly we're taking nouns as their objects. But verbs can also select or take verbs of their objects. So if I say I want to hear a story, and I want to hear is a verb. So want is a verb, to hear is an infinitive verb. And then the infinitive verb, the verbal object, has its own object because you want to hear something, in this case a story. All you need to do is to be able to say which is the main verb and which is the object in this kind of case. And I know that at least one of you has seen something like this. Continue to grow would be an example. It continued to grow. Continue is the main verb. The object verb is the infinitive to grow. So that's my structure. That's how I would do it. Here's another one. We have to learn how to live with that risk. So have is the main verb. To learn is the verbal object, and it's an infinitive. It starts with a to. And finally, appears to have. Once again, appears as the main verb. To have is the verbal object. Okay. There's no quizzes associated with this what's it called? This lecture. It's just to help you do the assignment. So we're used to seeing verbs take nouns as both subjects and objects. Sometimes we saw gerunds, like running is fun. We saw them as subjects. What we're seeing here is verbs can select for anything they want. It just depends on the meaning that is assigned in our brains when we learn the language. So sometimes they take verbs and whole clauses, or even whole sentences with many clauses in them, and clausal sentential modifiers too. These objects are important to recognize because they can get you into a bit of trouble when you're identifying the main verb of a clause, sometimes simply because there's more than one. So I hope this lecture has helped clarify that issue a little. It'll appear, well, it has appeared in week 2 and also week 3. All right.